They built a galaxy that spoke in sound, then forgot what silence meant. The station trembled with a low mechanical hum, deep enough to vibrate through steel walls and into bone. Warning lights pulsing red every half second across the docking bay as automated systems announced evacuation orders in overlapping frequencies. Voices layered in 6 languages, all urgent, all ignored by the one person standing still. Lyra didn't turn when the alarms rose, didn't react when the crowd surged past her, didn't flinch as cargo crates rattled across the deck at 40 miles per hour, because to her the world remained perfectly, endlessly quiet, her pale blue skin catching the emergency glow like cold glass while her silver eyes searched faces that never looked back, not one of them slowing, not one of them trying, because everyone on this station knew what she was, a defect, a glitch in a civilization built entirely on resonance and sound wave communication. Ethan Cole noticed her because she didn't move, because in a place where everything was motion and noise, she was. Stillness, wrong in a way that systems didn't account for, his boots scraping metal as he stepped out of the maintenance corridor, grease staining his sleeves, a diagnostic tablet flickering in his hand with error codes he hadn't bothered to fix yet. But this wasn't a system error. This was something else, something human. He watched as a security drone hovered past her shoulder, projecting instructions she couldn't hear, then flagged her as non-compliant when she didn't respond. The label, blinking amber above her head like a quiet accusation, and for a second, just a second, Ethan almost kept walking like everyone else, because that's what you do out here. You don't interfere, you don't slow down, you don't get involved. But then she turned slightly, just enough for him to see it. The confusion, not panic, not fear, just the simple, devastating fact that she didn't understand why the world was leaving her behind. And that was it. That was the moment, the small fracture where routine broke. Ethan exhaled once, sharp, then dropped his tablet, the plastic clattering against the floor as he moved toward her, ignoring the evacuation countdown, ticking down in bold white numbers above the bay doors. 10 minutes, 9 minutes, systems failing in sections measured in square miles, pressure zones collapsing in sequence, but none of that mattered in the space between him and her. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the fine lines of bioluminescence beneath her skin, faint pulses like a language no one had learned to read. She looked at him then, finally, and for a moment the chaos faded, because she was waiting, not for sound, but for meaning. Ethan glanced at the nearest control panel, its interface screaming warnings he could hear, but she never would. And without thinking, without planning, he reached out and tore the panel loose, wires snapping free in a shower of dim sparks as he rerouted the output feed, his fingers moving fast, muscle memory from years of fixing things no one else wanted to touch. And then, he forced the system to change, converting signal to light, raw data into pulses, sharp, bright flashes cutting through the red haze, patterns instead of noise, information she could see. The panel flickered once, twice, then stabilized, and Lyra's eyes widened, just slightly, as the chaos finally spoke in a language she understood, her gaze snapping to the lights, tracking them, reading them, and then back to him, something shifting there, something new, while above them the system recalibrated, and somewhere deep in the station, something else began to notice. The lights did not stop once they started speaking to her. They pulsed in steady intervals across the broken panel in Ethan's hands, white and blue patterns cutting through the red emergency glow, and Lyra followed every shift with absolute focus, as if the entire universe had suddenly narrowed into something she could finally understand. Her breathing slowed, shoulders easing just enough to show the difference between panic and clarity, and Ethan saw it happen in real time. The moment confusion turned into recognition, not because the world had changed, but because someone had changed it for her. He adjusted the wiring again, tightening a loose connector with his thumb as the panel flickered, then stabilized into a cleaner sequence, arrows, timing markers, directional cues, simple but precise, and he angled it toward her, tilting his head slightly, not speaking, not rushing, just giving her the space to read, to process, to choose. And she did. Her eyes moved from the panel to the corridor behind him, then back again. Then she nodded once, small but certain, and that was enough. Around them, the station continued to unravel in its own mechanical rhythm, bulkhead doors sliding shut in segments, 30 feet at a time, sealing off sections of the docking ring while automated carriers sped past on magnetic rails, their engines humming through the floor in vibrations that Ethan could feel, but she could not. The evacuation timer above the bay dropped to 7 minutes, then 6, the numbers ticking down with quiet authority, and still no one stopped, no one turned back. Because in a system this large, this efficient, one person who could not hear instructions simply did not fit into the equation. Ethan stepped to the side and pointed, first to the flashing path indicators along the floor, then to her, then forward again. A simple sequence. Go this way, stay with me. And for a second she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of habit, as if waiting for someone else to override the moment. But no one did, and so she moved, one careful step, then another, matching his pace as they entered the main corridor, the lights above them stuttering between red and white as power rerouted in real time, casting long shifting shadows against the metallic walls. A security drone descended from the ceiling track ahead, its lens focusing with a soft mechanical click as it scanned them both, a projection field flickering to life in midair displaying text and audio commands that Ethan barely glanced at. But the moment it registered Lyra again, the amber warning icon reappeared, brighter this time, more insistent, labeling her as non-responsive, inefficient, delay risk, the kind of classification that made decisions quickly and without question, and Ethan felt it before he fully understood it. The system was not just ignoring her, it was preparing to remove her from the equation entirely. He shifted his grip on the panel and stepped slightly in front of her, blocking the drone's direct line, his jaw tightening as he scanned the interface. Then without hesitation he rerouted again, forcing the drone's output into the same visual channel, hijacking its communication stream so the commands burst into light instead of sound, sharp pulses reflecting across the corridor walls, and Lyra's head lifted instantly, her attention locking onto the new pattern, understanding spreading across her face like sunrise over cold glass. For the first time since the alarms began, she was not behind, she was not lost, she was part of the system moving forward, and the difference was almost invisible to everyone else. But to Ethan it was everything, because it meant she could keep up, it meant she could survive, and as they moved deeper into the station, side by side, the system began to adjust around them, not by design, but because one human had refused to let it stay blind to silence. The corridor narrowed as they moved, the ceiling dropping a few inches lower every 20 yards, forcing taller species to duck. While Ethan adjusted his pace instinctively to match hers, not too fast, not too slow, just enough to stay in sync as the floor indicators shifted from steady pulses to rapid directional bursts, guiding evacuees toward the outer docking ring, and Lyra followed each flash with growing certainty, her movements becoming smoother, more confident, as if she was finally walking inside the same reality as everyone else instead of just observing it from the outside. Ethan kept the modified panel angled, where she could see it, the light patterns reflecting faintly across her eyes, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to notice the detail there. The way her irises caught and held the signal, translating it into something meaningful, something human, even if she was not, and he wondered how long she had lived like this, surrounded by voices she could never access, instructions she could never follow, a system that had no place for silence. A sharp flicker overhead signaled a shift in power. Routing and the corridor lights dimmed for half a second, just long enough to break the pattern, and Lyra slowed immediately, her gaze searching for the next signal, the hesitation returning like a shadow, and Ethan reacted without thinking, tapping the panel twice, forcing a manual override to boost brightness, the light snapping back into clarity, and she looked at him again, just for a second, a question in her expression, not spoken but unmistakable, and he gave a small nod, the simplest reassurance he could offer, and it worked. She kept moving. Ahead, the flow of evacuees bottlenecked near a transit junction where 3 corridors converged, bodies pressing shoulder to shoulder, tension rising in subtle ways, faster steps, tighter movements, no one stopping, no one yielding, because time was running out. 5 minutes now, the countdown projected across the far wall in stark white digits, and the system began prioritizing efficiency over comfort, redirecting traffic with sharp bursts of audio commands that Ethan could hear echoing through the space. Layered, urgent, overwhelming. But Lyra only saw confusion again as the crowd shifted unpredictably, the patterns breaking down into chaos. Ethan scanned the junction quickly, his mind mapping alternatives, maintenance routes, service access points, places the main system did not monitor as closely, and then he saw it. A narrow side corridor marked for authorized personnel only, barely wide enough for two people to pass. Its indicator lights still functional, still stable, and more importantly, still quiet in its own way, not crowded, not overloaded with signals. He touched her arm lightly, just enough to get her attention, then pointed toward the side passage, tracing the direction with his hand before stepping toward it. And she hesitated again, not because she did not trust him, but because nothing in her experience had ever suggested that stepping away from the main flow could be safe. But then she looked at the crowd again, at the broken patterns, the unreadable movement, and then back at the steady light in his hand, and she chose him. They slipped into the side corridor just as a new wave of evacuees surged through the junction, the noise behind them fading into a distant vibration through the walls, replaced by a quieter, more controlled environment where the lights pulsed at a consistent interval, guiding them forward in clean, uninterrupted lines. And for the first time since this began, there was space, breathing room, a path that made sense, and Ethan felt the shift immediately, not just in the environment, but in her, the way her shoulders relaxed, the way her steps aligned with the rhythm of the lights, the way she no longer looked lost. But the system had not forgotten them. Deep within its network, a deviation had been logged, a route change that did not match expected patterns, and somewhere beyond their reach, something recalculated, not with emotion, not with judgment, but with cold precision. And as they moved deeper into the quieter corridor, the lights ahead flickered once, just once, before stabilizing again, as if the station itself had started to notice that something about this path, about them, did not follow the rules anymore. The air felt different in the side corridor, cooler by a few degrees. The hum of the station softer here, like a distant engine instead of a storm, and the lights ran in clean, measured pulses along the floor and walls, steady enough to form a rhythm Lyra could follow without hesitation, her steps aligning with it naturally now, no longer chasing meaning, but moving with it. And Ethan noticed how quickly she adapted, how precise her movements became once the chaos was stripped away, as if the problem had never been her ability to understand, but the world's refusal to speak in a way she could receive. He slowed slightly, glancing back at her, making sure the distance between them stayed constant, not leading too far ahead, not leaving her behind, and she matched him without effort, her gaze shifting between the path and the panel in his hand, reading both, combining them into a single flow of information that guided her forward. The countdown ticked down to 4 minutes. The numbers now projected intermittently along the corridor walls as auxiliary systems took over, and Ethan could feel the subtle change in the station's behavior, systems tightening, routes recalculating, priorities shifting toward evacuation completion rather than individual navigation, and that meant less tolerance for deviation. A soft flicker passed through the lights ahead, barely noticeable, but enough to catch his attention. The pattern stuttered for a fraction of a second before correcting itself, and he stopped, just for a heartbeat, watching, waiting, and Lyra stopped with him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tracked the disruption, not confused this time, but alert, aware that something had changed. Ethan moved to the nearest wall panel, smaller than the one he had torn free earlier, but still connected to the local system. He pressed his palm against it, fingers tracing the edge until he found the manual access seam, then pried it open with a controlled motion, the panel hinging outward with a soft metallic click, exposing a cluster of fiber lines glowing faintly in blue and white. He adjusted one connection, then another, not breaking anything, just nudging the system back into stability, reinforcing the light output so the pattern would hold. And as he worked, he felt it, a delay in response, a hesitation in the system's feedback loop, as if something on the other end was watching the change instead of immediately correcting it. Lyra stepped closer, her attention fixed on his hands, on the light shifting under his touch, and when he finished, she reached out, not to the panel, but to the air between them, her fingers moving in a small, deliberate motion, a gesture he did not recognize at first, but then she repeated it, slower, more defined, pointing to the lights, then to him, then back to the lights again. And it clicked, not as language, not exactly, but as intent. She was asking if he was the one controlling it, if this change, this translation, belonged to him. Ethan paused, then gave a small, almost uncertain nod, and something in her expression softened, not relief, not quite, but recognition, as if she had just identified the source of something she had never experienced before. And for a brief second, the station, the countdown, the failing systems, all of it faded into the background, leaving only that quiet exchange between them. Then the corridor lights dimmed again, not a flicker this time, but a controlled reduction, the pattern slowing, stretching out, becoming less precise, and Ethan looked up sharply, the numbers above them shifting to 3 minutes, and he understood immediately. The system was adjusting, not to help, but to limit, to standardize, to pull everything back into its original design. And that design did not include her, did not include what he had done. And for the first time since he stepped into this, Ethan realized this was no longer just about keeping up. It was about staying seen, because somewhere inside the station, something had begun to decide that silence did not belong in its equation. The lights stretched thinner with every step. No longer crisp pulses, but elongated beams that blurred at the edges, as if the station itself was trying to smooth them out, to erase the clarity Ethan had forced into existence. And Lyra slowed again, not because she was confused, but because the pattern was changing in a way that felt deliberate, like a language being taken back mid-sentence. Ethan saw it too. The timing drift, the intervals widening by fractions of a second that only someone used to reading systems would notice. And he exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on the panel as he walked, thinking faster now, because this was no longer random failure. This was correction, the system rewriting itself to remove what did not belong. He glanced at the wall projections, the countdown now at 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the numbers steady, confident, indifferent, and beneath them a new layer of instruction began to appear, simplified directives designed for mass movement, arrows, color codes, broad commands that assumed everyone could hear, could react, could comply, and Lyra could see none of it in a way that made sense anymore. She looked at him again, not panicked, not yet, but searching, waiting for the translation to return, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, but urgency sharpened into decision. He could keep patching local panels, fighting the system one segment at a time, or he could do something bigger, something that would force the station to adapt instead of resist. He stopped abruptly, turning toward a sealed maintenance hatch set into the right wall, its indicator dim but active, and Lyra halted with him, her eyes following his movement as he crouched and pressed his hand against the hatch seam. Fingers finding the override latch by instinct, he pulled it open with a firm motion, the panel sliding aside to reveal a narrow service space filled with bundled cables and access nodes glowing faintly in layered colors, the kind of place no civilian ever noticed, the kind of place where systems spoke to each other without translation. He stepped inside, then looked back at her, raising the panel slightly so the light still faced her, then gestured, simple and clear. "Stay, just for a moment." And she did, standing at the threshold, watching, trusting him in a way that had not existed minutes ago. Ethan moved quickly now, deeper into the maintenance channel, his hands navigating the network of connections until he found the central relay cluster for this section, a junction point where audio signals were distributed and synchronized across multiple corridors. He paused there, just for a second, feeling the weight of the decision, because what he was about to do was not a repair, it was a rewrite, a deliberate change to how the system communicated, not just for her, but for everyone in range. He connected the panel output directly into the relay, bypassing the standard audio prioritization, forcing the system to carry visual signals alongside sound at equal strength, his fingers moving with practiced precision as he rerouted the pathways, stabilizing voltage, aligning frequencies, building a parallel language inside the station's core functions. And as he finished, the effect was immediate. The corridor outside brightened, not in color, but in meaning, lights sharpening, patterns snapping back into clarity, synchronized across walls, floors, and overhead displays, a network of visual guidance spreading outward like a ripple. Lyra stepped forward instinctively, her eyes widening as the world came back into focus. Not just the small panel in his hand, but the entire corridor speaking to her in light. Consistent, readable, alive. Ethan stepped back out of the hatch, closing it behind him as he looked at her, searching for confirmation, and she gave it, a small, certain nod, stronger than before, and for a moment, just a moment, it felt like they had won something quiet and important. But above them, the countdown dropped to 2 minutes, and deeper within the station, the system registered the change, not as damage, not as failure, but as something new, something it had not been designed to process, and this time, it did not immediately correct it. It paused, as if considering, as if the equation had gained a variable it could not yet solve. The corridor transformed in a way no one had planned for. Not louder, not faster, but clearer, every surface now carrying intention through light, signals flowing in synchronized patterns across walls, floors, and ceiling panels. And Lyra moved through it with a precision that no longer looked like adaptation, but belonging, her steps aligned perfectly with the visual rhythm, her gaze no longer searching, but reading, understanding, choosing, and Ethan saw it, the shift from survival to awareness, the moment she was no longer catching up to the world, but moving with it. The countdown dropped to 1 minute and 30 seconds, the numbers now embedded directly into the light sequences, integrated into the same visual language he had forced into existence. And that was when he realized something unexpected. The system had not rejected the change, it had incorporated it. Not fully, not willingly, but enough to keep functioning, enough to keep the station moving toward evacuation without breaking apart. Lyra slowed for just a fraction of a second, her eyes catching the integrated countdown, tracking it, processing it, and then she looked at him again, not with confusion this time, but with something closer to realization. As if she understood that what she was seeing now had not existed before, that this clarity, this access, this connection to the world around her, was something new, something given. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, a quiet confirmation that yes, this was real, and yes, it was for her. Ahead, the corridor opened into the outer docking ring, a wide circular space lined with exit gates spaced every 50 feet. Each one marked by a cascade of light signals guiding evacuees toward transport vessels waiting beyond the sealed airlocks. The space was less crowded here, the flow more organized, the system regaining control as it funneled everyone outward. And for the first time since this began, there was a clear path to safety. But as they stepped into the ring, something else became visible, not in sound, not in movement, but in pattern, a subtle delay in the light sequences above them. A fraction of a second where the system paused before updating, as if it was still adjusting to the new variable, still recalculating its own logic. Ethan noticed it immediately, his eyes tracking the delay, his mind mapping the inconsistency, and he felt it again, that quiet tension beneath the surface, the sense that the station was not just adapting, but observing, learning. Lyra followed his gaze upward, her expression shifting slightly as she noticed it too. Not as a flaw, but as a question, something unresolved in the flow of information, and she stepped closer to him, not out of fear, but out of instinct, aligning herself with the one constant in a system that was still deciding what to do with her. Ethan adjusted the panel in his hand one last time, stabilizing the output, reinforcing the clarity of the signals around them, and then he pointed toward the nearest exit gate, its light pattern steady, direct, unmistakable. A path forward measured in feet instead of uncertainty. She followed his gesture, then looked back at him, and for a brief moment, the movement around them faded again, replaced by something quieter, something human, a silent exchange that needed no translation. And then she nodded, not small this time, but certain, and stepped forward. The gate ahead began its opening sequence, the lights shifting into a final pattern that signaled transition, inside to outside, containment to release, and the countdown reached 1 minute, the numbers steady, unchanging, absolute. But as the system prepared to complete its function, it carried something it had not been designed to hold, a language of light that had started as a workaround and had become something more, something that could not be easily removed without breaking the flow it now depended on. And for the first time, the station was not just guiding its inhabitants to safety. It was doing so in a way that included someone it had once ignored. And somewhere deep within its network, that change remained, not erased, not corrected, but present, waiting to see what would happen next. The gate did not open all at once. It unfolded in layers, panels retracting in smooth, measured segments as the light above it shifted into a final sequence, bright and steady, guiding evacuees forward in a controlled stream. And Ethan stepped closer, instinctively positioning himself just slightly ahead and to the side of Lyra, not blocking her path, but anchoring it, giving her a fixed point in a world that was still changing, faster than it could fully understand. The countdown dropped to 45 seconds, the numbers now embedded seamlessly into the visual flow, no longer separate, no longer something she could miss. And Lyra followed the pattern with complete clarity, her steps confident, her posture steady, as if the uncertainty that had defined her place in this world had finally been replaced by something solid. But as they reached the threshold of the gate, the lights flickered again, not in failure, but in hesitation, a pause that stretched just long enough to be noticed, and Ethan felt it immediately. The system was recalculating, not because it was broken, but because it was encountering something it had not resolved, and the delay rippled outward, small at first, then slightly more pronounced, affecting the timing of the sequences along the docking ring. Lyra slowed, her eyes tracking the disruption, not confused, but aware, and she looked at Ethan again, not asking this time, but waiting, trusting that he would understand what she could not hear. And he did, his gaze moving upward, scanning the pattern, identifying the inconsistency, the way the system was trying to reconcile two different modes of communication at once, sound and light, neither fully dominant, both competing for priority. He stepped closer to the gate control panel, a larger interface embedded into the wall beside the opening, its surface alive with shifting data streams, and he placed his hand against it, feeling the faint vibration of the system beneath, the constant hum of processing, decision-making, correction. For a moment, he did nothing, just watched, just listened in the way only someone used to machines could listen, not to sound, but to behavior, to timing, to the subtle language of systems under pressure. And then he made his choice. Instead of forcing another override, instead of pushing the system back into compliance, he adjusted his approach, his fingers moving across the interface to align the visual output with the station's core timing rather than replacing it, synchronizing the light patterns with the existing signal flow so they no longer competed, but merged, a single language instead of two conflicting ones. And the effect was immediate. The flicker stabilized, the delay vanished. The patterns locked into place with a clarity that felt intentional, designed, as if it had always been this way. Lyra saw it happen, her eyes widening slightly as the world around her snapped into perfect coherence, every signal consistent, every direction clear, and for the first time, there was no gap, no moment where she had to guess, no space where she was left behind. She stepped forward without hesitation, crossing the threshold of the gate as the final sequence guided her through. Ethan followed a half step behind, watching her more than the path, making sure the system held, making sure the change stayed. And as they moved into the docking platform beyond, the space opened up into a wide expanse of steel and light. Transport vessels lined up in precise rows, their entry ramps extended, their own guidance systems now reflecting the same visual language, carrying the change forward beyond the station itself. The countdown reached 30 seconds, and the flow of evacuees continued, steady, controlled. But something had shifted beneath it all, something subtle but irreversible. The system was no longer just processing. It was adapting, not rejecting the new input, but integrating it at a deeper level. And as Lyra stepped onto the ramp of the nearest vessel, she paused, just for a second, turning back toward Ethan, her gaze holding his, not with confusion, not with fear, but with something that did not need translation. And in that moment, the station, the system, the entire structure built on sound alone, carried a new truth within it, one that had started with a single decision and had spread through everything it touched. And somewhere in that vast network, The equation had changed in a way it could no longer ignore. The ramp beneath their feet vibrated softly as the transport vessel powered up, a low, steady hum that carried through the metal like a heartbeat, and Lyra stepped fully inside, her eyes immediately catching the continuation of the light patterns along the interior walls, softer here, calmer, but still precise, still readable, guiding passengers towards seating areas and safety harness points without the chaos of overlapping commands, and she followed them instinctively, her movements smooth, assured, as if she had always belonged in a world that spoke this way. Ethan paused at the threshold for just a second longer, glancing back toward the docking ring where streams of evacuees continued to move through the gates. Every surface now alive with synchronized light, the system no longer resisting the change, but using it, carrying it forward beyond his reach. And he realized something he had not expected. This was no longer his fix, it had become part of the station itself. The countdown dropped to 20 seconds, the numbers reflected in the polished floor beneath his boots, and he stepped inside, the ramp sealing behind him with a smooth mechanical motion that cut off the open view of the docking ring, leaving only the interior space of the vessel, enclosed, stable, quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than empty. Lyra had stopped a few feet ahead, standing near a row of seats, her gaze moving slowly across the cabin, not searching for direction anymore, but observing, taking in the details of a space that now made sense to her. And when she turned back toward him, there was something different in her expression, something steadier, as if the uncertainty that had once defined her place in the world had been replaced by something she could hold on to. Ethan walked toward her, slower now, the urgency of movement fading into something else, something quieter, and he adjusted the panel in his hand one last time before setting it down on a nearby console, no longer needing to carry it between them, because the system around them had taken over, had learned, had adapted. For a moment, neither of them moved, the hum of the vessel filling the space in a way that Ethan could hear, but she could not, and yet it did not matter, because the light above them pulsed gently, marking time in a way they both understood, a shared rhythm that did not depend on sound. Lyra lifted her hand slightly, hesitating for a fraction of a second before completing the motion, her fingers forming the same gesture she had used before, pointing to the lights, then to him. But this time there was something more in it, not just a question, not just recognition, but acknowledgement, as if she was naming what had happened, what he had done, even without words. Ethan met her gaze, understanding enough to respond in the simplest way he knew. He nodded, once, steady, and in that small exchange, something settled between them, not spoken, not defined, but real. The vessel's internal lights shifted subtly as pre-launch systems completed their sequence, the patterns adjusting to indicate departure readiness, and across the cabin, other passengers followed the visual cues without hesitation, without confusion, as if this had always been the way things worked, as if the idea of a system that only spoke in sound had never existed. Lyra looked around at them, at the way they moved, the way they responded, and then back at Ethan, and for the first time, there was no distance between her and the world around her, no barrier she could not cross, no instruction she could not understand. The countdown reached 10 seconds, and somewhere beyond the sealed walls of the vessel, the station completed its final evacuation protocols, systems stabilizing into their new configuration, carrying forward a change that had started with a single decision. And as the engines prepared to engage, Lyra took one small step closer to Ethan, not out of necessity, but by choice, aligning herself with the one person who had seen her when the rest of the galaxy had not. And in the quiet space between them, the absence of sound no longer felt like something missing. But something understood. The vessel did not roar when it launched. It moved with a controlled, measured force that pressed gently against the body, a steady acceleration that carried them away from the station without drama, without chaos, and Ethan felt it through the floor beneath his boots, through the seat frames, through the structure itself. But Lyra did not, and yet she knew they were leaving, not from sound, but from the shift in light, the patterns along the cabin walls transitioning from directional guidance to a slow outward pulse that mirrored the motion of departure, a visual echo of something she had never been able to perceive before, and she watched it with quiet focus, her eyes tracking the rhythm as the station beyond the hull drifted farther into the dark. Ethan moved to the viewport, a narrow, reinforced panel set into the side of the cabin, and looked out at the structure they had just left behind. Its massive ring now illuminated in a way that felt different, not just functional, but expressive, every section carrying synchronized light signals that flowed across its surface like a living network, not random, not chaotic, but intentional, designed. And he realized with a strange clarity that what he had started in a single corridor had spread across the entire station, not as a patch, but as a change in how it communicated, how it saw the beings moving through it. Lyra stepped beside him, her gaze following his toward the station, and for a moment they stood there in silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something shared, something understood without translation, and she lifted her hand again, slower this time, more deliberate, forming a new gesture, one he had not seen before, her fingers tracing a small arc in the air before settling over her chest, then extending outward toward him, a motion that carried meaning even without a defined language, and Ethan felt it, not as words, but as intent, as gratitude shaped into movement. He hesitated for just a second, then responded in the only way he knew, placing his hand lightly against his own chest, then lowering it, a simple acknowledgement, imperfect, but real, and she watched him, her expression softening in a way that did not need explanation. Across the cabin, other passengers settled into their seats, guided entirely by the light patterns that now filled the space. No confusion, no hesitation, as if this had always been the system they trusted, as if the idea of relying on sound alone had already begun to fade into something outdated, something incomplete. The vessel continued its ascent, distance stretching between them and the station measured now in miles, then dozens of miles, the structure shrinking against the vast backdrop of space. And yet its new language remained visible even from afar, faint pulses of light traveling across its surface in coordinated waves, a signal not just of function, but of change. Lyra leaned slightly closer to the viewport, her eyes reflecting those distant patterns, and for the first time, she was not outside of what she saw, not separated by an invisible barrier, but part of it, included in the way the world moved and communicated, and Ethan realized that nothing about her had changed, not her hearing, not her nature, not her place in the universe. What had changed was everything else. The cabin lights dimmed gently as the vessel transitioned to cruise mode, the patterns slowing into a calm, steady rhythm, and Lyra turned back from the viewport, her gaze finding Ethan again, holding it for a quiet moment that stretched just long enough to matter, and then she gave a small nod, not as a question, not as a request, but as a statement, a recognition of something that had already happened. Ethan returned it without hesitation, and in that exchange, there was no need for explanation, no need for words, just the simple, undeniable fact that one decision, one act of refusing to walk away, had shifted an entire system, not by force, not by command, but by making it see what it had never considered before. And as the vessel carried them deeper into open space, the station behind them continued to glow, not louder, not brighter, but differently, as if the galaxy itself had learned, in the quietest way possible, that silence was never the absence of meaning, only the absence of someone willing to understand it.